An iced-over Beechcraft 18 lands under a heavy storm on Cambridge Bay's small runway. The just over 600-person hamlet has surprisingly good amenities, including a fully stocked Medicare facility and lodgings. The plane is carrying a mining engineer and an oil service driller that were needed at the Swan Lake mining camp along the Arctic coast. The previous day's attempts to get them there was fruitless. The weather was far too bad to even get halfway. The plane was forced to turn around back to Yellowknife. Today's attempt went better. They made it to Swan Lake but found a runway iced and snowed over. Due to low fuel and the plane rapidly gathering ice, the group had no choice but to keep going to Cambridge Bay, where they would try again the next day. Upon landing, a nurse approached the pilot, Marten Hartwell, and asked him if he was available to do a medevac that was coming in from the hamlet of Spence Bay. The patients needed to get to Yellowknife and possibly Edmonton within the next few hours. Marten didn't want to go, but told her that he would wait for the incoming flight and speak to the pilot when he landed. An hour later, the Twin Otter DC-6 from Spence Bay landed, carrying 4 passengers. A pediatrician, a nurse named Judy Hill, and the 2 patients, Nimi Nuliak and David Kootook. The pilot of the Otter and Hartwell both worked for Gateway Aviation in Edmonton, a well-known and respected charter flight business that worked almost exclusively with bush pilots in the far north. The two discussed who should go, and what plane would make the flight easier and faster. It took some convincing, but a very nervous Hartwell conceded that the Beechcraft could take more fuel and fly faster, so he would be taking the trip back to Yellowknife. The blizzard seemed to be breaking a bit, and thanks to the Beechcraft's larger tank, he could drop off the passengers and make it back to Cambridge Bay in one long 6-hour flight session. Marten Hartwell fueled up the 18, loaded Judy, Nimi, and David into the plane, and took off into the fading sun of the Arctic afternoon. It was just past 3:30 p.m., and Hartwell, who had little experience flying by just instrument, was going to be cruising in a pitch-black sky in about 2 hours. Immediately there were issues. The storm had picked up again, and the radio began cutting out. He couldn't raise Cambridge Bay Station, Contwoitu Station an hour into the flight, or Yellowknife Station 2 hours in. The blackness of the winter Arctic night had finally set in, completely blinding the pilot to his trajectory. His compasses were useless, thanks to their proximity to magnetic north. He would pull out a map and start plotting his course by his relative position. Perhaps if he was looking where he was going, he would have seen the evergreen tree and pitched the plane up. Then again, maybe he wouldn't have, thanks to the sheer darkness in front of him. An ancient and mighty evergreen clipped the port side wing of the Beechcraft 18. The plane collided into the hillside, going around 350 kilometers an hour. Judy Hill was a registered nurse from Kingsbridge in Devon, England, excelling not at just nursing, but also dentistry, teaching, and doctoring. In a letter home to her parents dated November 7th, a day before she got onto Hartwell's plane, she stated, "It's been a funny old week, and I shall be glad when it's finished. We've had 2 patients I've been worried about." She spoke of Nimi and David's conditions, how she was doing the best to help them, and that she would be sending Christmas presents home to England after her trip. "Sometimes the responsibility of this job seems to weigh awfully heavy," she would write. Her disappearance would prove devastating to medicine in the Northwest Territories. Nimi Nuliak was a mother of 1 and 8 months pregnant with her second. She had lost 2 children previously to complications of labor, and this current child was no different. She was once again in the premature stages of labor and needed to get to a hospital if the baby had any chance of survival. Yellowknife was a 3-hour flight away, so Judy got her on the quickest flight available. Accompanying her was David Kootook, a 14-year-old with a case of acute appendicitis, who also just happened to be her cousin. He had never flown before. And finally, the pilot, Marten Hartwell. At least, that's what he wanted to go by. Gefreiter Leopold Hermann was a German immigrant to Canada. He had been trained in the Nazi Luftwaffe to fly gliders. East Germany was a war-torn hellscape post-war, and Leopold would try farming and cobbling before finally falling back into aviation to make money. He would leave his wife and child behind and come to Canada in 1967. He would arrive in Quebec, further his flight training, and finally get his pilot's license. He got a job with Gateway Aviation out of Edmonton, and at the time of the crash, he had been working there for 6 months and was completely unfamiliar with most areas of the Arctic. Marten awoke to cold wind blowing in his face. He was still in his pilot seat, his legs pinned under the controls by the body of a woman. She was limp, but breathing. He tried to push her off, but found he didn't have enough strength to do it. David entered the cockpit and helped Marten pull out the now identified Nurse Judy off of his legs. By the time they got her on her back, she had passed away. Nimi had also been pulled from the wreckage by David. She was lying on the stretcher just outside the crash site, still battling her labor pains and now with a broken neck. Marten took stock of his injuries. What was working, what wasn't. His nose was broken. It now lay sideways across his face. The hand that was holding onto the plane's yoke was sprained and couldn't be used. He also couldn't move his legs. With later x-rays, it would show that his left knee and both of his ankles were shattered. David would come out of the crash mostly unscathed, other than the psychological trauma. The two men went about setting up a crude tent, as the plane's fuselage had too many holes to provide enough insulation from the cold, and they couldn't start a fire in such a confined space. They used the tarps and the sleeping bags they had, and made a serviceable lean-to for the three of the survivors to sleep in. During the first night, Nimi succumbed to her injuries, and would pass away. It was just the two men now, and Marten needed David to do basically everything. The day after, they took stock of their rations. 6 7-ounce cans of corned beef, 4 packages of chicken noodle soup, 12 bouillon cubes, 1 12-ounce package of rice, 1 large box of instant mashed potatoes, 40 sugar cubes, and 12 packets of raisins. They should have had 2 pounds of hardtack, called Pilot's Biscuit, that was supposed to be in the box. It was not. Judy also had her medical supplies, and was given lunch before leaving Cambridge Bay. 6 cheese sandwiches, a few cookies, and a thermos full of coffee. Thankfully, the Beechcraft's fuel tank was within walking distance, and David collected all the gas he could. They did have some tools at their disposal. There was a hatchet, a net, a snare, a hunting knife, a survival booklet, a lure, and a length of fishing line. From their vantage point on top of the hill, they could see a lake, so fishing was an option in good weather. They also had a distress beacon. The pair worked tirelessly to get it going, and 4 days later, they would start it up, but only for 5 hours at a time. Marten was unsure if they had enough battery power to keep it running 24 hours a day, despite the fact that they had 4 extra batteries. David was still adjusting to the whole scenario. He had come from a nice, centrally heated home, and was so used to flat, barren tundra that was well above the tree line that he had almost no experience with making a fire or cutting tinder. Thankfully, he was sharp, attentive, and keen on surviving. For the first week, the two started their day out the same. A small sip of coffee with 2 sugar cubes, some tinned beef, and rice or potatoes on the side. It was as cozy as they could make it, but eventually, as with anyone stuck in the long, dark Canadian winter, depression started to set in. The average temperature was -40, going up to -60 with the wind chill, which is enough to make anyone go stir-crazy. First, it would be Marten that would talk of dying. Once he would finish, David would start. Each time, they would try to cheer the other up. A major boost to spirits would be a package of cigarettes they found in the wreckage. The two chain smokers would make short work of it. By November 16th, their 8th day, there was talk of David maybe walking out and finding help. The snow was chest deep in some places for the diminutive teenager, but Marten couldn't stop him. They had a rough idea of where they were, and by rough, I mean they really actually didn't have any idea where they were. Thanks to a 37-kilometer-per-hour wind, Marten had drifted almost 200 kilometers east of their expected route. Not only would this make it near impossible for searchers to find him, it meant anywhere he would send David would be completely off of the map. The pair decided that if he couldn't find help, he would at least try to get to the lake and do some fishing. An hour later, he would return. Breathless and covered in snow up to his chin, it was impossible for a boy his age to get to that lake with nothing to orient him. They set up snares to try to catch a rabbit or a ptarmigan, but by day 10, it was clear that this part of the Arctic was barren to most fauna. The teen didn't want to give up, though. On November 22nd, their 14th day there, David once again made the trek out to the lake, and this time he was actually gone for 3 days, giving Marten hope that he had actually made it. On November 23rd, a plane flew overhead but didn't stop. The beacon was either broken or the pilot was ignoring it. November 25th, and David returned empty-handed and frostbitten. He had found a dead caribou that was mostly picked clean by wolves. Marten sent him back for the scraps. November 27th, and David returns to the camp once again empty-handed. He either couldn't find the carcass, or it was just a hallucination due to hunger. The men would finish the last of their rations, and eat the lichen that David collected on his walk. November 29th, David's stomach begins to cramp, and every howl of the wind started to sound like a plane overhead. A deep depression sets into both of the men at the same time. Marten had already written his last letter to his son. He suggested that David also write one to ease his mind. December 1st, 23 days since they went down. Marten is finally feeling better and strong enough to try to walk. This is just in time, as David is slowly wasting away. He had to be helped up to relieve himself, and his breaths are getting more and more shallow as the minutes pass. He is weak and lifeless and needs sustenance, but since the rations have all been exhausted, it was down to eating emergency candles that they had found. Marten had talked about doing the unthinkable, cannibalism. As a vegetarian, it was hard for him to even think about eating potted meat and chicken soup, let alone one of the cadavers. He brings it up to David, who had been subsisting on bark, moss, and leaves, and once again, he immediately refutes him. "Shut up," he said. "I'm not eating anyone," and resigned himself to die. The two barely speak. Marten understands and keeps assisting him as best as he can. Desperate to try to assist the dying teen, he goes into Judy's medicine bag and finds some tranquilizer to give him. As the morning matures, David's breaths become more and more shallow, to the point where he stops breathing. Marten tries to resuscitate him using CPR, but it's no use. David Kootook, the 14-year-old with no survival training, not only lived for nearly 24 days in -40 with almost no rations, but he also took care of a grown man to the point of near recovery. At the time of his death, David weighed 75 pounds. Marten pulls him out of the tent, gives him the best snow burial he can, and then finds the corpse of Judy Hill and begins to cut away at her thigh. The sound of a growling can be heard from outside of his tent. Marten readies his hatchet in case a pack of wolves were attracted by the smell of cooked meat. He exits the tent to see a large plane flying above. He grabs the flares that David had found and waves it. Instead of the plane ignoring him as usual, this time he sees a parachute. One of the parachutes lands close to him. It contains cooking and heating supplies that are too heavy for his emaciated body to carry. Also included are preserves and chocolate. He gorges himself to the point of sickness. A few moments later, two Canadian paras walk into the camp. Master Corporal Harvey Copeland, a veteran of over 200 jumps, has a hard time stomaching what he sees. The nurse's torso had been carved up and was laying out in front of the tent. Both her legs were butchered, and Marten only had time to eat one of her thighs. The paras try to play it cool, but one of them has to excuse himself to vomit. Marten responds, "Welcome to the camp of a cannibal." Marten Hartwell is returned to Edmonton to recover. He meets up with his girlfriend Susan Haley in Yellowknife, and she follows him home, working with him on his court case and navigating reporters the entire way. The case was rife with rumors. An Edmonton radio station, 630 CHED, piggybacks on some of the larger rumors and spreads them throughout the city. Marten had worked David to death. They all engaged in cannibalism when they went mad. He was a full-blooded Aryan Nazi, etc., etc. Susan, Marten, and Susan's father all fought the claims, and when his case was finished, Marten would make his way up north, away from the misinformed public. In some later interviews, he said that anyone south of the tree line never understood his actions and saw it as a form of barbarism. Anyone above the tree line understood what he did and what he needed to do to survive. Marten would shy away from the public eye, wanting to be forgotten and live a peaceful existence with Susan, and eventually their two baby girls. He would get his pilot's license again and start up a charter flight company called Ursus Aviation out of Fort Norman. He only had one more recorded crash 15 years later. While bringing supplies up to a fishing village, he clipped a tree with a pontoon of his plane. It took him 2 days to walk out of the woods back to safety. When he appeared in Fort Norman, everyone cheered. Despite his want to fade into obscurity, his ordeal was just too interesting. Stompin' Tom Connors, a legendary Canadian folk singer, wrote a song about his ordeal. CBC would interview him a few times, and in the 90s, Peter Tadman would write a book about the crash and the court case afterwards, with very limited involvement from Hartwell himself. He would pass away on April 2nd, 2013, at the age of 88 years old. Nimi would be remembered with a small grave in Edmonton. Her family was given compensation for her and her unborn child, a baby girl. She is fondly remembered by the daughter that survives her, and in 2017, the government of Nunavut would pay to have her body moved back to her village. Judy Hill's body was cremated after the autopsy, and her ashes were spread in Banff National Park by her boyfriend. The hamlet of Spence Bay would be renamed to Talayoak, and the nursing station she worked at would eventually be christened with her name. Gateway Aviation's reputation would be irreparably damaged by this ordeal. Hartwell was found at fault due to his inexperience at instrumental flying, but Gateway was ultimately the ones who lost the court case. The question of why Marten flew was brought up, as Gateway had a much more capable Douglas DC-3 coming into Cambridge Bay on the same day, just a few hours behind him. They said it all came down to pilot error and pilot choice, which didn't satisfy anyone. In 1979, they were bought out by Northward Airlines, which itself would declare bankruptcy a year later. The Canadian government would also be called into question during the trial. The radio beacons that were supporting Bush aviation were outdated and low-powered, and over the course of the next decade, all of the beacons that Hartwell flew by would be doubled in strength. Finally, and most importantly, David Kootook. His heroic efforts wouldn't be forgotten, eventually. Initially, he was buried beside Nimi in a small unmarked grave, but a year later, former Edmonton councillor David Ward would press for some sort of recognition from all levels of government. In 1993, after Tadman's novel would reignite interest in the case, the Edmonton municipal government would put up an Inukshuk and plaque off of Jasper Ave and 97th Street. In 1994, he would get federal recognition, receiving the Meritorious Service Cross for his actions helping Hartwell. This story is far from the craziest when it comes to bush pilots. Let me know if you want to hear more about the adventurous and wild world of bush piloting in Canada's north. Thanks for watching.